So let me welcome everyone. My name is Ralph Michaels. I teach comparative law at the law school. I welcome everyone to this place. I see that the audience is almost entirely, as far as I can see, non-law school based. So I welcome everyone here, especially who made all the way. And I blame very strongly my own colleagues and students at the law school, who apparently figured that the first day of classes was not yet a day to be illuminated. Because illuminated, we will be today. This is a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and admired colleague Chaim Saiman from Villanova Law School, who's presenting his book on Halakhah, the Rabbinic Idea of Law. As you can see, we have exactly as many copies for sale outside as we have people in the room. So if every one of you buys the book afterwards, it will come out exactly. Even it's really a fabulous and exciting book. I've been able to observe its production over several years, I think. It is challenging in ways that I, of course, as a at best consumer and not at all expert in Jewish law, can only see from the outside, in presenting a view of Halakhah as both law and more than law, pushing in the middle of a conflict that he will present much better on not just the role of Halakhah and Jewish law and law within Judaism, but also really on the theory of law, our understanding of law, the role of law in society, etc. more broadly. So it's a book that's really not just of interest to people interested in Jewish law in particular, but also to comparative lawyers like myself, interested in conceptions and roles of law more generally. I will let Chaim present and talk about the book. I think he said he'll speak about 30 minutes, is that right? And we will have another 30 minutes after that to really discuss all issues, I would say, of the book or really anything else that he would know about, and that's related to the broad theme of Halakhah. So with no more further ado from me, I'll give over to Chaim. One more thing. I think we were promised food at some point. So it may be that food will appear, it may be that food will not appear. We will leave that in the hands of whoever is provides. We'll see. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. We got a chance. Don't worry. We got a chance to talk to the law faculty earlier, so this is like the fun stuff after hours. And thank you, Ralph, for that introduction. So here's what I want to do. Basically, I want to talk about 4 issues with you. 1, to raise what is the book's central question. 2, to establish the framework of an answer. 3, to offer an example. And then 4, to discuss some of the implications and complications of that answer. So the book's question is as follows. The word halakhah, right, in Hebrew, is almost always, when translated into English, is translated as Jewish law. That hasn't always been the case. If you look back maybe 200 years ago, you saw Jewish ritual, Jewish rites, but clearly in the last 150, 200 years, if translated to English, it's always as Jewish law. Now, there are many good reasons for that. If you know very little about Halakhah, but you probably know it's about rules, a lot of intricate rules, very granular rules that govern behavior, and that presents itself and structures itself as law. The thing that we call the Code of Jewish Law begins with the laws of awaking in the morning, Dinei Hashkamat HaBoker, and marches through the day until it has the laws of going to sleep, and then what is called the laws of modesty, which are the laws of sexual encounters. So there's like a law for everything. Passover, the holidays, etc. So there's many good reasons to think of halakha as Jewish law. But when we use that term, particularly when we use that term as moderns, we can't but escape, this is where it ties a lot into Ralph's work, the question of a modern legal system. And we carry with it all those metaphors and all those associations. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about. Now, when we think about what is a modern, so what I want to talk about is halakha Jewish law, or how halakha is Jewish law? And my answer is going to be that it does both much more and much less than what we have come to think of as law. So, what is law for? So if you talk to, in the modern American legal academy, most laws, you would say, are there to curtail wrongdoing. So people lie, cheat, and steal. Because people lie, cheat, and steal, we need laws to prevent that. Right? The Mishnah has a phrase, were it not for the fear of the government, people would swallow each other alive. Which sort of represents this idea that, well, it's a mode of social control and social regulation. And then some legal scholars would push and say, but there's a different type of law. There's also what we call coordinating functions. So which side of the street to drive on, it's not about right and wrong, it's not because people are bad, but we need those laws in order to make sure that, society functions. But if you take both of those together, that's pretty much sort of the standard mainstream American account of what law is for. This was pithily expressed by a law professor of a generation or two ago known as Grant Gilmore. That was his name. He was a professor. He ended his career at Yale Law. And at the end he wrote this book called The Ages of American Law. This is the kind of book that when I was going to law school, the law school would send you the summer before a reading list of here's things to read to kind of get yourself ready for law school. And if it was a fancy law school, they sent you the book. If it was a less fancy law school, they sent you the list. But this is this kind of book. So it's like a 130-page short book. And it's the kind of book that scholars sometimes write at the end of their careers, where they kind of sum up what they've done, so that all their books and articles are like the footnotes, and then they just give you the kind of main claims on top. And Gilmore here is summarizing, I think, a 100-year tradition in American legal thought as follows. And he says, the better the society, the less law there'll be. In heaven, there'll be no law, and the lion shall lie down with the lamb. The worse the society, the more law there'll be. In hell, there'll be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed. And what he's saying here, right, is really what is sort of summarized what he said, that, well, if the reason we need law is because people are bad, so therefore, if people are not bad, we don't need law. So we're all the bad people in hell. So they need lots and lots and lots of law. We're all the good people in heaven. So you know what they don't need? They don't need law. So I want to contrast this image of the law in heaven, or here almost a kind of conceit about a law in heaven, with the story that appears in the Talmud, also about the law in heaven. So the context of the story we'll leave right now, but the story starts as follows. They were arguing in the Academy of Heaven. Now, the story will go on, but I want to linger on this phrase and focus on the noun and focus on the verb. So what's in heaven? There we go. Heaven look like this? That's too Christian. You can go for a kind of more secular, maybe kind of some Jewy, secular, Christian thingy. Most, I bet you about a quarter of New Yorker cartoons are about God or heaven. For a avowedly secular paper is kind of interesting. But an academy, that's strange. So I want to go back. So in heaven, there is an academy. No angels, no liars, no halos, flutes, harps, all the stuff we typically associate with heaven. Now, that's just, if you think about the biblical origins, right? How does the Bible describe heaven? Well, in Ezekiel and in Isaiah, there's angels, there's seraphs, there's a kind of heavenly military industrial complex, right? So there's a lot of that kind of heavy pageantry, and that kind of trickles into the New Testament. And then if you think about all the artistic renditions you've seen, right, in art, in literature, an academy is a very unusual thing to have in heaven. So that's the noun. One thing about the verb. Let's free associate for a minute. What verbs or words come to your mind when we think about heaven? Calm, peace, relaxing, edifying, wholeness, arguing. It's a harsh word. It's a tough word. It's contention. It's debate. It's dispute. Not typically the things we associate in heaven. So in the Talmud's heaven, my line about this is not the only version of heaven in the Talmud, but it's a version of heaven only the Talmud can have. So that they're arguing in the academy. Okay, now if we say that there's an academy in heaven, what department? What faculty, if we want to be more European? Theology, metaphysics, right? What's the curriculum? We finally get, so clearly God is going to be sitting on the high table, and all the students below, maybe something like this. And finally we're going to hear the answers to those great questions that we individually and we collectively have been asking for centuries. Right? What else could the Academy of Heaven be? But of course, the setup, you hear that that's of course not what the Talmud's going to say. So what's going on in the Talmud's Academy of Heaven? So it says, who are you in the Academy of Heaven? If the blotch on the skin preceded the white hair, he is impure. And if the white hair preceded the blotch on the skin, he is pure. Okay, any idea what this is talking about? In law school, we call them people.
You want answers?
Sure.
It reminds you of getting old, and then you lose your melatonin, and you get your white hair, and you get your blotches, and I'm not sure which comes first or what. So.
Okay, so we're talking about some kind of skin malady. Maybe we have to do with aging.
Leprosy.
I'm sorry?
Leprosy.
Leprosy. Okay, right. So in the book of Leviticus, it describes a disease which the King James, and therefore in English, we call leprosy. And that's probably what this is talking about. So this is a discussion actually found in the Mishnah about who is considered to have, in Hebrew it's called tzarat, but again, we'll use the word leprosy. And it tells us that, well, not every kind of skin malady qualifies. If the blotch comes first, that's impure. That means you have leprosy, no good. If the flip, then that's okay. Now this is actually taken from the Mishnah. It's something so obscure that even the Talmud doesn't analyze this tractate. All right, so this is kind of weird. But then it gets even weirder. Because say if there was doubt as to which came first, right? Because we have one rule if the blotch comes first, one rule if the hair comes first, and what if we don't know? Now, I want to stop here for a sec. So we're talking about this academy in heaven, and what are they're discussing bodies, right? It's very interesting to me. This is a very physical thing, and this is not just a physical body, but I would say a deformed body, a lacking body. Now, does anyone know, according to the rabbis of the Talmud, who gets leprosy? So the rabbis of the Talmud say that someone who speaks what they call lashon hara. Lashon hara is like evil speech, but it means something like gossip or talebearing or kind of chattering about others to know for no good reason. American law doesn't have this norm. It's very interesting. In America, if you say something and say, hey, let's gossip, what do they say? Well, it's true. Right? Truth is a defense. This is not the case in Jewish law. So, but to think about it, so we have this case about a physically deformed body which comes from a kind of spiritual lacking or a morally deformed body or person in heaven. Now, I've never been, but we assume that there are no bodies in heaven, and even if there are bodies, they don't belong to those who are sinners, or to those who are spiritually lacking, and certainly there's not physically lacking bodies, and yet this is the case. But this case generates a factual doubt, and that factual doubt now says as follows. What do we know if the doubt as to which came first? So this creates a legal doubt. The Holy One, blessed be He, i.e. God, says pure, while the rest of the academy says he is impure. And then, of course, the final part. So if God and the angels are arguing over a finer point of law in heaven, who can decide but a rabbi located on earth? Now, I like this story because in a short couple of things, it tells us a lot. First of all, law is described here. Now, when we think about the law in heaven, there are other images that come to mind. In fact, if you were starting with the Bible as we go, God is judge. Sitting around the high holidays on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, this imagery is very rich in the liturgy. But note here that the law in heaven is not put in a court, but in a law school, in an academy. Note that the law is not the ideal heavenly law is not clear and known, but contested and debated. The facts aren't well known, and the law is not well known, and the law about what to do when the facts aren't known is not known. And we're talking about a case that almost, by definition, can't exist in the heavens because it's about spiritually deficient bodies. So I think this is all telling us something about how the rabbis conceive of law, or at least one of their conceptions about law, which is both different from, I would say, the biblical understanding, but also very different from the way we do, right? This is the opposite of Gilmore. Gilmore thought that in heaven, of course, there's no law because there's perfection. And the Talmud turns this all upside down. Now, I want to go from this story to a very different story about law. Not so much on heaven, but very much on earth. And this, I want to do an analysis of this flyer. Something that its authors never intended to happen, which is that people would be looking and doing a kind of close literary analysis of a sign that appeared in a synagogue about 4 or 5 years ago that I was visiting. I don't understand why they use Art Deco, so we'll just have to say they did. But let's kind of look at this for a second, because parts of this are very, very ordinary, and parts of this are very, very strange. So here's the ordinary part. It tells us when it is, what time, what date. That's basically the top. And then the bottom tells us who's paying for the food, because that's really important. Now, in that sense, as you walk the halls of the Duke Law School, and I presume the other faculties, you'll see signs and posters all over the place. There's even one for this event. And they all have some version of this information. Who's, right, where it's going to be, when it's going to be, who's talking, and the topic. But now let's kind of focus a little bit, and I'll do some translating about who's talking and the topic. So this is happening on Saturday on Shabbat, where normally one is not supposed to engage in discussions about business. That's for the profane. So let's focus on who's talking. So his name is Rav, which is Rabbi Eliyahu Levine. Okay. But let's look at his title. So his title, I'll read it first, and then we'll try to make heads or tails of it. He's the Rosh Kollel of the Lakewood Kollel for Choshen Mishpat. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Rosh Kollel. A Kollel is attached to a yeshiva, but it's like an institute of advanced study. So the yeshiva is like the regular college, and then this would be like the program. So he's the head of that program. So what, now where, the Lakewood, so Lakewood is a town in New Jersey, home to the largest and most prestigious yeshiva in the United States. So if we were using the law analogy, this is Harvard Law School. And Choshen Mishpat is the part of the Jewish law code that we'd roughly translate as commercial law or business law. So to put it all together, this is the Sullivan Cromwell Professor of Corporate and Commercial Law at Harvard Law School. And what's he talking about? So he's talking about bidding competitively on goods or properties when others are involved. So for the lawyers in the room, this is something like tortious interference with contract, or the duty of good faith in contract negotiations, to borrow a phrase, lawyer's law. Now, if I ask you anywhere else, if I tell you that in America, at any given date or time, some bigwig from some academic institution is coming to talk about the finer detailed points of contract law, where is this happening and in what setting? Law school, academic conference, maybe talking to a group of practicing lawyers. But that's not at all what was going on here. There are about 150 lay people, none of who was practicing contract law as identified in these sources. It was Shabbat, when you're not really supposed to be talking about business. And it wasn't exactly practical. It was like a kind of analytic discussion about the different talmudic sources. And he started with those that had a broad duty of good faith, and then some of the narrow ones, some case law. So in no way was this actually geared toward here's how to do it. So anywhere else in the US, this would make total sense in a kind of law school setting, and utterly incomprehensible in any other setting. It's certainly not a religious setting, certainly not on Shabbat. When you ask people why they were there, they said, well, they didn't use these words, but they would say, for spiritual enlightenment. And I love contract law. I've taught it for 12 years. Spiritual enlightening is not one of the terms that typically attaches to it. So the question is, what is going on here? And the answer is that, yeah, in form it might be something like business law or contract law. But that's not really what's happening. If you ask the participants what they were doing there, and I think this will connect to what they were doing in that academy in heaven, they would say they're studying Torah. In Hebrew, Talmud Torah, which is a religious obligation seen as a spiritual endeavor that connects man to God. In some versions, this study of law is the pinnacle of human achievement. Now, maybe here in the Duke Law School that might make sense. But, ask any plumber or teacher or management consultant or doctor or any normal person, and that's an absurd idea. And yet, this is what's going on. Now, it's not just this one little synagogue on Long Island. This is a picture of MetLife Stadium on August 1st, 2012, where 90,000 people gathered for the completion of the Talmud based on a 7.5-year cycle that learns or studies a page a day. So it's big, massive book club. The next one will be actually January 1st of next year, so it's coming up. Now you ask, what draws 90,000 people to an event space? Well, a couple of years later, they played the Super Bowl there, right? And sports and rock concerts and these very kind of mass pop culture things. But to tell you that the celebration of an extraordinarily long and even more excruciatingly abstruse and technical book about the finer points of the law is what does it, again, sounds absurd. So this is kind of the question that I'm after in this book, is that what is this centrality, not just of law, but about its study, that kind of pervades rabbinic culture from its earliest to its latest periods? I'll say virtually every other academic book on Jewish law ignores this. And maybe later we can get into why. But that's exactly why I wanted to put it at the center of what we're talking about. And this is why I think the word law, it doesn't quite work. Because if you swap in law as we understand it into any of these contexts, as we've tried, it's absurd. But though it looks like law, in some ways it's law, maybe in many ways, in other ways it's not, and that's what I want to try to figure out. Now, this structure, I think, feeds into two curious features of Jewish law seen as a legal system. One is what I call the relation between Halakhah and state, or Halakhah and governance. So typically, again, when we think about law, we think about a discourse that a society uses to govern itself. And the more important the society, the more governing it's doing, the more law there is. So in the 19th century, everyone was interested in English law, French law, German law. In the 20th century, American law. Now it's Chinese law, Islamic law, Indian law. Right? That law typically follows power and sovereignty. Now there's something very interesting about Jewish law, is that this doesn't happen. The earliest document of Jewish law, which we know is the Mishnah, comes together about 150, 200 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, meaning after the political entity that it is putatively governing no longer exists. So law is not a response to sovereignty, but law is a response to the loss of sovereignty. The second, related to that, is that throughout its history, Halakhah is never the sole governing structure of Jewish communities, but is always in some complicated relationship with other systems that it's either working with or cross purposes with or bumping up against. And it rarely, if ever, realizes its regulatory ambitions. So there's like a weak relationship between the law, or the stating of the law, and the actual administration of the law. The second point is this idea of Torah study. Why does God study it in heaven? And why do these people gather on Shabbat afternoon to learn about contract law? Because, well, it's not exactly law. It's Torah. It's God's religious, moral instruction. The closest analogy would be something like a liberal arts education, where we study these sort of classic texts of a canon in order to enlarge and ennoble ourselves as citizens, not necessarily for the specific knowledge. And so too the rabbis, I think, saw the study of law as a way of forming and forging the religious persona. But this, of course, raises a question. how do the avalanche of technical legal regulations that we find in the Talmud do this? So for that, I want to take an example to look at one of these rules that will appear strange, bizarre, and technical, and show and see how they're using that to have a different type of conversation. Now, because this is a tradition that studies itself, the only way to do it is to dive in and to follow them studying. So we're going to start with the biblical verse in Deuteronomy that describes the following question. I call this CSI Bible. What happens if you have a murder victim and you can't solve the case? So today we make TV shows about it. We'll come to some TV shows in a minute. But the Bible says as follows: if you find someone slain in the field and you don't know who murdered him, so then the elders and the judges, the bigwigs of the town, are supposed to go out and measure the cities closest to the slain. And then when they determine which town is closest to the slain, they're supposed to take a heifer, fancy word for a cow, and they're supposed to break its neck by a dry riverbed in some sort of expiation ritual. They literally wash their hands. This is where the metaphor of wash your hands from it comes from. But I want to focus on this sort of measuring to the city. So, in other words, we find a dead body, a murdered body. It's in the middle of nowhere. The community, the political problem is we have this crime that we can't solve. So what do? So we're supposed to measure to the nearest town, and then the nearest town is supposed to engage in some ritual that will fix this. That's in the Bible. Now the Mishnah picks up on this measurement thing, and being the Mishnah, takes it to its more than comical extreme. So it says as follows. We've got the body. If the corpse's head is found in one place, and the remainder of the body in another place, so they would bring the head to the body, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so in other words, we've got a clean cut. We've got the head in that corner. We've got the body in this corner. So Eliezer says, you pick up the head, you walk into the body, and you measure from it. Rabbi Akiva says, no. They bring the body to the head. Drag the body up there and measure. Now, if that weren't enough, which it never is, we go further. Which part of the corpse do they measure from? So now we have to, well, let's just do it. So Rabbi Eliezer says from his navel, and Rabbi Akiva says from his nostrils. So let's kind of just think about this. In order for this to be law in some kind of regulatory sense, we need to assume that there's a slain body who we can't figure out who killed him. That is perfectly equidistant from Raleigh to Durham, except that if you measure from here, you'll get the answer Raleigh, and if you measure from here, you'll get the answer Durham. Now, if you ask me, hey, maybe it's important to say where in the town you measured to, I would say, I think that's a great point, but the Mishnah doesn't talk about it. So that seems kind of absurd. If Paul knew of this Mishnah, he would have had a field day with it. But even just looking at this Mishnah, it's clear that there's some other kind of thing going on here, right? Because there's two debates, but they're both the same. Rabbi Akiva keeps on focusing on the head or the nostrils, and Rabbi Eliezer on the body or the navel. Now, I asked where this comes up. Any fans of Scandinavian television? So there's a show called The Bridge. And its premise is that long, majestic bridge. It's a combination of bridge and tunnel, right, between Denmark and Sweden. And that there's a murder. And that the body is perfectly equidistant on the border between Denmark to the south and Sweden to the north. And this becomes a jurisdictional procedural drama about how we're going to deal with this. maybe they knew of the Mishnah. But outside of this, right, this seems like a pretty crazy case. So what's going on? So the Talmud is very interesting about this. It says, what are they arguing about? So Rabbi Akiva says, one master, the Talmud interprets this Mishnah, and it says that Rabbi Akiva says the primary element of life is in his nostrils. And Rabbi Eliezer says the primary element of life is in his navel. Now, we could go into this a little bit, but what kind of question is this? So, I think if we were medieval monks, let's say, or medieval philosophers, we would think of this as a theological question. Right? What is the essence of man? Is man fundamentally physical, as he is anatomically? Or are humans spiritual? We could think of this as a physiological question, as a neurobiological question. Where is consciousness? Today we put diodes on the head and stimulate it. Right? I would say as follows. Every society, in its own way, asks these humans, are they different? How are they different? How do we think about them? Right? However complex or primitive your biology, there's a lot of commonalities to animals. And yet, that never quite seems to answer the question. So as regulation, this seems ridiculous, sophistry. We ask, does it happen? What kind of case is this? How do these inches of space matter? But what the Talmud does is it shifts register. And it says, no, we're asking a different type of question. One that we might identify as philosophical, maybe theological. By the way, anyone guess what verse they quote for Rabbi Akiva? Yeah. And God blew into his nostrils. So this is a kind of question that's asking what every society asks, which is, what is human? Now, why are they asking in the context of this weird case? Well, think about it. When you drive down the road and you see a dead rat you won't even see, a larger animal you'll swerve. But if you see a human, you stop the car, you get out, you investigate, you call the police, you engage the body politic. You say, we can't have this here. That begs the question of why is this life form different than the others? And that's, of course, what's going on here. But the point is, while I say it parallels what we might talk about as philosophy or theology or something like that, it's not. It's encased and enrobed and engrafted into a halachic question or a legal question. And that's what I mean, that the halakhah uses law, or here's an example of how they're using law to have a different type of conversation, with law as its kind of front end, but think of it as like the tip of the iceberg, but which it goes much deeper. This might explain why Torah study is so important. Because to the extent it's just about regulations, then maybe, like every society, we should say there should be a class of people we call lawyers, whose job it is to know and give advice about the regulations. But the rest of us can go about our lives and do more productive things. But if the study of Torah is engaging in these types of questions, maybe that's why God in heaven, who can do anything, chooses to do this. And maybe that's some of the point behind putting the study of Torah at the center of the religious experience. Now, I'm not claiming that every Talmudic discussion works this way. I think that's crazy. But we ought to be open to the fact that at least some of them do, and at least some of what's behind this sort of obsessionism with not just the law as rules, but with its study is going on. So the way I think about it, we could think of Jewish law or halakhah as existing along two poles. One of being what I'd call a standard story about law. Law is regulation. But the other one of law as Torah, which I mean by God's instruction, and that one engages in it devotionally even if its substance is legal. And the reason I put those magnets there is because I think each of these poles exist and also exerts a pull on the field as a whole. That there's always going to be some people, some readers, some communities that are going to yank it this way, and some readers and some communities and some people that are going to yank it the other way. And as I see it, the tension of Halakhah is that it stands between these two. Now, let's think of some of what I would call the implications and complications of nestling broader concepts in law. Because to the extent what I'm saying is right, is that we're using the legal discourse and the legal form to talk about all these other sorts of things. Now, this creates, I would say, something, a pro and a con. Because social systems can exist with multiple competing norms. But law, as legal scholars call it, is an imperializing discourse. It likes to be in charge. It doesn't like to have lots and lots of legal norms running around. Right? It wants to monopolize them and tell you these ones are right and these ones are wrong. Moreover, the process to resolve these sorts of questions are different. We resolve legal questions by taking it to court, and the court comes up with an answer. So, in Jewish law, we could say that the debate about how to measure has an answer. To the extent we're talking about the narrow legal question, right, there are rules, and typically we say we follow Rabbi Akiva more than Rabbi Eliezer. But to the extent that these are kind of reflective of these much more basic and larger questions, those social questions are too big for the law. The law can't answer them. You could try to put an answer there, but it's just going to reemerge elsewhere. So as we expand outwards, the question becomes too big for a simple legal decision. Now I want to go to our friend Antonin Scalia, who was sitting, he said this statement, he was on a panel at the Juilliard School with a bunch of people in the performative dramatic arts. So this was not his crowd, right? So the rest of the crowd was, New York liberal society, and people in the creative arts tend to be. And Scalia, who was known to be an opera lover, was sort of invited there to be the kind of contrarian, a position he liked a lot. And they kind of get into their various jobs and what they do. And he says there something which I think is interesting. He says the main business of a lawyer is to take the romance, the mystery, the irony, the ambiguity out of everything he touches. So he's talking to these people that come to celebrate the arts, and he says, what you do is great. But it's great because you are outside of the legal sphere. But when you come into my domain, what you're doing is horrible. Or to apply the methods you use is bad. Because what we need from law is to flatten things, is to limit possibilities, to foreclose options, because otherwise it's not law. And therefore Scalia is the proponent that whatever you think about the value of the arts and literature and all these things, which is great, it should be kept far, far away from law. Because law, in order to work, needs to have all the opposite qualities. And this, I think, is to me, the central tension of what Halakhah is about. Because it's trying to do both things Scalia is talking about at the same time. On the one hand, it is a regulatory discourse, and it does aim to guide behavior and to constrain choice, and all those things. And in that way, there's always going to be an effort to take out the irony, the mystery, the ambiguity from it. On the other hand, the study aspect of Torah study looks at these very same texts. And unlike Scalia that said, keep your law separate from your cultural text, uses the very same text in tools of, I would say, irony, mystery, ambiguity, wordplay, midrashic analysis, to become a format for people to invest themselves in and come in touch with life's great questions. And that, to me, is like the central feature, an interesting feature of halakhah, and what it means for it to be law and not be law, because it's constantly bouncing between these two poles. So thanks so much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
I'll sit up front to help you, but you can call on
Sure.
people yourself. Really.
Sure. Yes, sir. And just tell me your name as you...
Jonathan Gerard, retired rabbi. Why do you think the Halakhah has failed to answer the difficult questions such as the Amunah or the inability of a wife to leave an abusive marriage, or any difficult question that you might think about? Why haven't these? What has been the problem with applying the Halakhah to these questions?
So I think we need to be specific what we mean by these questions, because Agunah is a very specific question with a very specific history, if that's what you're asking.
Well, I think Halakhah is a dynamic term itself. It doesn't really mean law. It means the application of law. So I'm asking hasn't the legal Jewish community succeeded in applying the law?
So I think
in certain cases.
Sure. So let's just, for the benefit of everyone else, back up and explain what the Agunah situation is. The Agunah literally means it's an anchor. That's what the word means. And it refers to the anchored wife, or the anchored wife who's anchored to her husband, who has left her, but remains married, technically, and therefore cannot get remarried. Now, this comes from the fact that in Jewish law, there's an asymmetry in the power relationships between the man and the woman. As traditionally conceived, the woman must be divorced by the man. Now, traditionally there was an answer to this, which is that the Jewish courts and community had power to apply various social pressures to the man who had effectively abandoned marriage, but not issued a bill of divorce. The modern Agunah problem stems from the interaction of liberal democracies, which do not give, and maybe for good reasons, religious communities power to issue coercive action against their adherents, right? With the structure in which only the man can divorce, but the woman can't. So that is the modern Agunah problem. Now, why hasn't, now, there have been various solutions in various communities, right? So some communities simply said, let's equalize the marriage clause and allow the woman to divorce the husband as well. Other communities don't accept this. That's too radical a change. So they've tried to use various rules of both Jewish and American contract law to circumvent it. And that's sort of where we are. Unfortunately, there are situations that fall between the cracks. Now, why isn't it solved? In the communities it's not solved is because they maintain a view of marriage that's not where the man and the woman aren't equal. And you can force that, but you can't really. Because this is one thing you learn about law. If the underlying community doesn't accept the legal solution, it's not going to work. So happens in certain in more conservative, religiously conservative communities, where they've been resisting what we would call unilateral no-fault divorce. And that creates the Agunah problem. So I think that the reason that it hasn't been solved is because there are subsections of the Jewish community that are very afraid of adopting kind of Western conceptions of marriage, where it's easy entry and easy exit. I mean, that's why. Now, can it be solved? Sure, but you need to build the social will. Why is the social will not there? Well, there's all sorts of reasons for that. Now, when they try, this is what's interesting. right? What I find fascinating about questions like this is that we say the woman can't remarry. Well, of course she can remarry, right? In American law, she can, I mean, nothing prevents her from moving to a different state and remarrying. More than that, nothing prevents her from going, if this is an Orthodox situation, from going to a conservative or Reform Jewish court and issuing a bill of divorce. And you ask her, well, why don't you do that? And she says, well, because that's not my community. Or so there's something very interesting going on here where, what do you mean by can't? Of course she can't. Right? We're not in a, she's going to face no physical threats, no financial threats, but she can't do it and become and remain part of her community.
Her children will be mamzerim, for which there is no remedy.
But again, she can, according to who? Right? If she goes to a baking, that will free her. According to that. So what the point is that there's something very interesting. This is not all what the book's about, but there's something very interesting about this dynamic where people say, I want the legitimacy from the source of the legitimacy I believe and adhere to. And that's where these wickets happen. Right? Let's take a very different example. In Orthodox setting, a woman cannot, let's say, leave the services. Right? Now, if you say, you know what, there are plenty of synagogues, we call them Reform and Conservative synagogues, that will allow a woman to leave services. So they say, go there. And they always say, no, I don't want to go there. That's not, because I don't recognize that form of authority. So there's something very interesting in that one both wants, so of course a woman could leave services, she can leave Jewish services, but she can't leave Jewish services in a certain type of community, but that's the community that she recognizes as being normative. But the very fact that makes it normative is also what's preventing her. So this is I think these questions are very complicated, particularly in areas where there's choice. Right? Where of course you can go, many people here can go to synagogues that are fully egalitarian. There's nothing preventing them, but that's not what they want. They want the community that constructs their norms to be the one that grants these norms, and that's exactly what they can't do.
That claims to own Halakhah. It's the only community that claims to own Halakhah.
So let someone else claim to own Halakhah. Yeah.
Some of these issues become they're more disruptive to your model because there in Israel has been the merger between the state and the law. So the search in the myopia and the curves of the letters for God has enormous significance at the conclusion now, because you will have a marshal coming in and asserting the monopoly of coercion for the religious law. So something like this
Okay, so we ought to
takes a whole different significance in Israel because that very first bullet you had is no longer true.
Okay, so right. So let's now transition. I assume you're talking about America. In Israel, the situation is different, right? So in Israel,
and just to be clear, I'm not talking in a normative way about whether Israel should be a theocracy. So I'm addressing your argument about whether the magic of Halakhah suddenly changes because.
Well, the last chapter of the book's about that.
Okay.
The last chapter of the book is about that. It's called The State of Halakhah and Halakhah of the State. So let's just start with the fact that I agree, right? In other words, so just a little background, right? So Israel is generally not a halachic state, right? For all sorts of reasons. Questions of what they call personal status, but basically means marriage, divorce, and a couple of other things, are given over to the rabbinate, which is effectively like the agency of Jewish law, to apply halakhah in an unmediated way. That's correct. I think it's an unmediated disaster. Precisely because it is hooking up a system not intended for communal authority, but not for coercive state authority, to it. And that's why all the problem is. Because when it's communal authority, you always have the communal advocate, which is what we were talking about. In Israel, and it's not surprising that this is the biggest flashpoint in Israel, precisely because it takes a system. And in the book I talk about, not only because there's a bunch of problems in Israel, The one that people most recognize is that they apply a version of Halakhah to a community that doesn't believe in it. That's also a problem. In the book, I talk about it saying even if the community bought it, Halakhah is not structured for the modern state. Its architecture isn't like that. Right, so I'll give an example. Halakhah has many, many standards. From permitted to prohibited. So it will say things like, suppose Ralph and I are engaged in in negotiations, to go back to our contract thing, and we're pretty close to a deal, and then I pull out. So Halakhah says there's no contract. But God will curse the person who backs out. Another example, in tort law. So in tort law, there's always questions of causation. Right? How close to causation do you get? So then there's a category of cases where the causation is kind of indirect. And the Talmud says, in this case, you are exempt in the laws of man and liable in the laws of heaven. Now, how do you take that, either of those two, and throw it into state law? State law only knows how to do two things. Are we going to make you pay, or are we not making you pay? That's what it's good at. Halakhah is not built that way. It has hundreds of standards that are expressing the community's moral sensibility, which are very, very hard, if not impossible, to encode into state law. Because you can either say that you're exempt, in which case you're missing the liable in the eyes of heaven, or you can say you're liable, in which case you're missing the distinction between in the eyes of heaven versus in the courts of men. So for all sorts of reasons, I think Halakhah in its own terms is ill-suited for putting into a bureaucratic administration state. And I think the example you bring is one of them, not only because I think there's then a separate problem that it's very hard to coerce people into a normative system they don't buy into, but even beyond that, even at its essential level, it's not designed for that. Its history doesn't do that. And not surprisingly, this is where most of the frustration is. Yes, sir?
2 points. One, there's a TV show, I guess, analogous to the one you were talking about between Norway and Sweden, was it?
It's
Denmark. Well, they have one called the tunnel. It's in English. So the body is on the dividing line in the tunnel, and then I'm not sure where the navel is, but anyway, it has on one side. That's just a side point. Second thing is, could you go back to that first slide that had your 4 points, and if it's possible for a lawyer to do it, to give your answer to each of those issues that you raised? Yes.
Sure. I love your qualification, if it's possible for a lawyer to do it. That's excellent. Okay, so the book's central question is sort of the obsessiveness over the study of law, and the idea that the study of law is a central religious mandate and practice. Something that doesn't exist in secular systems and doesn't really exist to that degree in other religious systems. The framework. Well, the framework is my model, my this one. Sorry, I didn't design it to do this. Right, is to say that what we ought to understand here is this thing called Halakhah serves two kind of divergent functions. One, regulation, and the other one, what I'll call Torah, or devotion. The example was the example with the tunnel, or the bridge, right? Where we took something that is on its face, a very particular, bizarre regulatory question, but it becomes this vehicle for this more sort of devotional, existential question. And
which also makes many questions not have definitive answers.
Yeah, and that was the fourth one, the complication, which is some questions law can answer and do a reasonably good job at. The smaller the question, in other words, the lower the stakes, the more a court or any legal system can say, this is the answer. The bigger the question, the deeper the question, the more it drills into not just the legal roots, but the social and the religious and existential roots of a society, the less amenable it is to some sort of legal decision that sticks and holds it together, because those underlying issues and tensions are always there and can't be answered by the courts. The questions are too big for the law. So I hope that's, even though I'm a lawyer, that works. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, do you believe Jesus and Paul were critiquing Halakhah itself or the way in which it was practiced? And also, do you see what Jesus and Paul are doing as different in any significant way from the Musar movement or Hasidism in general, in emphasizing the spiritual dimension of Jewish life as opposed to focusing so much on the legalistic?
Sure. Okay. So sorry.
David Orenstein.
So David's right that I made the obvious choice of starting a book on Jewish law with Jesus and Paul, because I think they were. I mean, well, here's what we know, right? In the New Testaments, they critique the people that are called Pharisees. Yeah. Historically, it's a complicated mess as to sort of like what the relationship is between the Pharisees and the people who wind up writing the Mishnah. There's clearly some relationship, and now you can see where the positions lie. Some say these are basically the same people, and some say, yeah, there's kind of more intermediation. The other question is, the Gospels generally denigrate Halakhah. Now, are they putting up a straw man, right? A purposely excessive or extreme version of it to critique it, or are they reflecting what was then accurate practice? And again, there's different schools of thought. My view is the stories that are different, the ones with Jesus and Paul, are clearly in dialogue with the kinds of themes and ideas that we then see in the Mishnah. That's clear. What's also clear is that they are saying that the further you dig into the law, the more you lose the forest for the truth. And they come up with a religious, spiritual critique of that. Now, this gets back to what we talked about earlier about comparative law, right? In other words, that tensions exist between systems, but also within systems. So I think you correctly identify that if we skip to the late 18th and the 19th century, not surprisingly, as the legal movement of the yeshiva gets kicked off, it produces a kind of counter movement. Just like I think it's not surprising that at the kind of wellsprings of the Mishnah, we get Jesus, right? So I think that there are tensions within and between. And one of the things you're focusing on is the more really way to say it, there are real tensions. And real tensions are going to show up no matter how you do it. By the way, and then if you open up the box further, within the yeshiva movement, there are, like you said, the Musar, which is kind of within. So I think that we will get iterations of this because you can't possibly say that the service of God is about these rigid categories without someone asking and the flip side, right? You can't say, right? Because as soon as things get, and by the way, within Protestantism, which is quite anti-legal, right? Then there's always a search for where the limits are. Now, that doesn't mean the traditions are the same and they're changeable. They're obviously not. But it does mean that the kind of motivating tensions are going to be found and then refracted through the particularly texts and kind of historical practices of that community. Yes, sir?
Well, my name is Barry Ferris. I am one of those doctors you mentioned who happens to be here for Talmud Torah. But fascinating, you're contrasting and also translating law with halakha and describing the inadequacy of the translation with the broader concept of halakha. In Hebrew, in the Bible, you also have chok and mishpat.
You don't have
in the same context of your analysis, I wonder if you would then put chok, mishpat, and halakha, and is chok more like the law, flatter and more exclusive of the Torah that's part of halakha?
Okay, so it's a good question. Let's start with the law. The word halakha does not appear in the Bible. Well, no, but I think that's important. Right? No, there's just not a biblical term. In fact, the Talmud derives it from like a verse in one of the later prophets, but it's not part of the nomenclature at all. I would say the word missing is mitzvah, commandment. Right? So, and here's one thing I would say, right? Because so in the medieval period, they assigned different meanings to chok and mishpat. They understood that chok was a sort of law that did not have an obvious rational reason, whereas mishpat was a law that seemed to have a rational reason. So, for example, kosher was thought to be a chok, right? They didn't believe in the trichinosis theory. But that, God said you don't eat pigs. I don't know, right? Pay your workers on time was thought to be a mishpat. This is sort of not civil justice. The point I make in the book that I think helps kind of get to the difference between the biblical and the rabbinic view is the word mitzvah. So in the Bible, mitzvah is like the content of God's command, but it's a kind of generic whole, right? The commandment. In the rabbis, it becomes a kind of specific source of obligation. There is a mitzvah to recite the Shema. There's a mitzvah to eat matzah. There's a mitzvah to take the lulav on Sukkot. There's a mitzvah to put on the tefillin. Right? And that transition, I think, nicely captures the way this thing is moving from something like God's instruction in a kind of global, holistic way to a particular instance of obligation incumbent on certain people. And that's why... Sorry. And that's sort of one of the developments of what I call like the legalization. Of course, there are laws in the Bible, but there isn't a kind of discourse around the particular instances and emanations of specific obligations in the way that Talmudists and lawyers are really used to talking to. And I think tracing the word mitzvah kind of captures that. All right.
Good. The Academy of Heaven is endless, I think, and the Academy here came as close to that as we could. But we'll end it regardless. Thank you, everyone, for coming,
Thank you so
but thanks
much.
especially to Chaim for